Now we're going to look at the second sharpest variation of the Triangle Slav, Noteboom. d4, d5, c4, e6, knight f3, c6, knight c3. Remember in introduction I told you, what is the idea of this move order, d5, e6, c6? Black postpones the development of the knight on g8 and sometimes uses it to advance the f-pawn or take the pawn on c4. So that's the moment where we see what was the idea of this move order. In this position, we take the pawn on c4. D takes c4. Here, if black goes f5, we don't get the favorable version of the stone wall because white can simply play g3 and we have normal line of the stone wall. So that's why we take on c4 and we play the Noteboom. White goes a4. He can start with e3, b5, a4, bishop b4, but this is the main line, so it transposes to main line. It doesn't matter white starts with e3 or a4. So let's start with a4, bishop b4, and e3, as I mentioned before, is the main line. But here white has three choices. One is e4, which seems to be very logical move. Why to put the pawn on e3 when we can advance, get the center, and play e4? But the pawn on e4 is weak if it's not defended. So the difference between e3 and e4 can be that after b5, bishop d2, a5, a takes, bishop takes, cb and b3, which is the main line if the pawn is on e3. Now black can play knight f6 and we can already see that the pawn is hanging on e4. So after b takes c4, black simply takes the pawn on e4. So we already know that e4 is not the best move in this position. Now let's take a look at bishop d2. This is another line that white can choose to play, but still, black goes a5. It's very nice to go a5 in these positions because the bishop is defended on b4, so there are no tricks anymore. And next move after, let's say, queen b1, the idea is that black cannot really play b5 because after ab, normally black takes on c3, and after bishop c3, black takes back on b5. But in this position, white can take with pawn on b2, and he simply gets the pawn back on b5 and wins the pawn on c4 as well. So this is really bad for black. So after queen b1, very interesting is to go bishop d7. At the moment it looks ugly, like what is bishop doing on d7? But of course the idea is that black wants to play b5 so that black supports the pawn on c4, and generally when the pawn is on c4, it's very good to advance b5 and have this pawn majority on the queen side. So after bishop d7, let's say e4, b5. Position is still complicated, but black managed to advance b pawn without having any problems. He supports the c4 pawn, so I think that's quite fine for black. Now let's get back to the main line, and after bishop b4, e3, b5, bishop d2, now a5. So we already know the idea. After a5, ab, this pawn, we didn't blunder this pawn because after ab, we simply take the knight on c3, bishop c3, c takes b5, and b3. So here is critical moment because you should remember the move and you should not play logically developing move knight f6. We cannot really take on b3 because after bishop b5, white has quite an advantage. Bishop d7, he can simply take on b3, and black has horrible position. So after b3, our idea is to give this pawn on c4 and advance b4. We cannot do it at the moment because after b4, bishop b4, a b4, rook takes a8, we are exchanged down. And we cannot also play knight f6 because of this same idea. If we take on c4 and b4, white takes simply on b4 and we are left with a horrible position. So that's why after b3 we play bishop b7. Bishop b7 protects the rook on a8. So after b takes c4, we can move the pawn to b4. But before we go to this main line, let's see other moves on bishop b7. Another theoretical move here is d5. But it's quite bad for white. Because after knight f6, obviously we cannot take on d5 because now the pawn is hanging on g7 and not only the pawn will lose, but will lose the rook afterwards as well. So this is very bad for black. We have to play knight f6, covering the a7, a1, h8 diagonal. B takes c4. And once again, we don't want to take on c4 back. We move the b pawn forward, b4. Now, bishop f6. Well, here, if white wants to keep the bishop and play, let's say, bishop d4, b2, that's not really good for him because we can simply take on d5, or we can simply develop. So main line goes here with bishop f6, queen f6, queen a4 check, knight d7, all is quite logical, knight d4, and here there is a strong move, which is queen e7. So the idea of queen e7 is that we want to defend this knight and castle. After queen e7, white plays queen b5. Knight c6 is nothing to be scared of because after knight c6 we can simply take on c6. Queen c6 obviously is not scary because we can simply castle. Everything is defended. And if d takes c6, then after knight c5, white is in big trouble. Queen b5 does not help because after queen a7, c7 and king e7, this pawn will be lost, and the pawns a5 and b4 are very strong. The knight on c5 is perfect and white is in huge trouble. After queen b5, of course, you can also castle, but he can take on a5, so it's better to defend this pawn, and c7, just play king e7, and everything goes good. So queen e7, queen b5, rook b8. Now white takes on f5, and here bishop d5. Rook b8 was very nice because black could take bishop d5 with tempo. Now we are attacking the queen on b5, queen a4, bishop e4, f3. f3 is necessary because otherwise white cannot develop his bishop on f1 because the g2 pawn is hanging. So after f3, we don't move the bishop back, but instead there is counterattack. So you should be always alert for counterattack and active play when you play the Triangle Slav. e5, and this looks very good for black because if he takes on e4, I don't see any other move because, well, you can play knight c6, but after bishop c6, queen c6 and simply castle or b3, black has fantastic position. And knight could not go anywhere else. Let's say knight b3 looks bad due to bishop c2, and this pin is really unpleasant for white. And if he goes, let's say, on e2, then this bishop is blocked, and we simply can play bishop g6, and afterwards b3, b2, b1 is a huge threat. So after e5, white takes on e4, e takes d4, and e takes d4. At the moment, we can, of course, play queen e4, but after bishop e2, it's not so easy to develop. Black should play castle, queen d7, sacrifice this knight, but not that we are losing here because we have b3, very strong pawn, and white cannot stop b2, b1. He should play queen f5, but queen e3, and still black wants to advance the pawn on b2, b1. But after e takes d4, I think it's easier to play castle, bishop d3, and f5. This was played in the game of Sopiko Guramishvili 2011. Okay, so now we get back to b takes c4 and b4. That was our idea. Bishop b2, knight f6, bishop d3, and here white could also play c5. That's an interesting move because white wants to develop with check, control this a4, d1 diagonal, block the queenside pawns, and try to play in the center. If white manages to block the queenside pawns, he has great position because center is his, and these pawns on e-file, d-file, and c-file can be very dangerous. So castle, bishop b5, knight c6, and castle. Well, white now controls the movement of the a pawn, so we don't have any a4, but we have light squares. Queen d5, and we can block these pawns, I mean on white squares. Knight e7 here doesn't look good because then we leave the control of the e5 square, and after knight e5 I think white has pretty good advantage. He can move f3, e4, d5, and that might be really scary for black. So after queen d5, queen e2, and now knight e7. So now we see the point. Knight e5 is no more big deal for us. Actually, it's just mate on g2. And he cannot really move knight to other squares, like d2. He can only go on e1, but this looks quite ugly because knight on e1 disturbs the development of the rook on f1, and we can simply play bishop c6. Try to trade the bishops because this bishop on b5 is quite an annoying piece. It controls the movement of our pawns on queen side. And after bishop c4, we can simply go bishop queen d7, and then we can move the pawns forward. So let's see the main move. Knight f6, bishop d3, castle, castle, knight d7, knight d2, and here we play queen c7. This is the critical position of the whole variation of the Noteboom. White here has two ways to proceed to the game. One is to play f4 and allow a4, and another one is to play f3 and play in the center. What's going on in the main line you will see in part 2. So, see you soon!